Hello, Mrs. Mathers here with part 2 of chapter 20. We're going to look at imperialism in Central and Southeast Asia and then imperialism in Africa. This picture here is a cartoon. It's an Afghani in the middle. Save me from my friends. Both Russia, as represented by the bear, and Britain, as represented by the lion, had a great interest in Afghanistan. First of all, the British thought that the Russians wanted to take over all of India. By the way, this occurred in the 1800s, so make sure to write that down. It was called the Great Game, and it wasn't really a game. Both sides were preparing for war, and they both eventually withdrew from Afghanistan. But Afghanistan will continue into the modern era to be a really critical juncture point. As you know, the United States has had forces in Afghanistan, and it is an access point to many oil-rich regions of the Middle East. So the Southeast Asian control, then, just to summarize, and I've already talked about this a little bit, but we have Spain is in the Philippines. There is a war, actually in 1898 to 1899, and then the U.S. takes over control of the Philippines from 1898 to 1946, and then they gain their independence. The Dutch are in Indonesia. Britain takes control of Burma and Malaysia, and then, as I also mentioned before, France has colonized Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and eventually that will lead to the Vietnamese War. I'm going to give a tribute to this woman here, Sarah Baartman, before we begin to talk about Africa. As the white Europeans started moving into parts of Africa, some were very fascinated by the different types of bodies that they saw in Africa. In fact, there were some that even questioned what is human, and that's something that we need to talk about in class. But I want to highlight her and just memorialize her because she's just a really good example of how abused some of the people of Africa were during this time of colonization. She was born in 1789 to the Xhosa tribe. I've talked about the Xhosa before. They were the ones that were involved in the great cattle killing. She was basically kidnapped from her home and displayed in freak shows in Europe. So people would pay money to go see her. Of course, she didn't get the money, and she was put in something like a cage for them to see her. And there are actually some really grotesque political cartoons or editorial cartoons about her and her body that I don't even want to show. She died at the young age of 26. Her body was autopsied and actually dissected, and parts of her body were preserved and actually put on display for people to look at out of their interest in these African people. So to Sarah Baartman, who was also called the Hottentot Venus, which was sort of a sexualized term for her. I just want you to know about her and to recognize her humanity. She was not a freak show. She was a human being who was caught up in what was really a horrible chapter in history. So in the Scramble for Africa, this is what we call imperialism in Africa. Europeans, especially some Americans, but Europeans for the most part were interested in just dividing up Africa for its massive resources. Before 1875, there were small settler communities in parts of Africa. In particular, they were interested in gold, always, iron for the industrial machines, palm oil to grease the industrial machines, and then they exchanged these for guns and manufactured goods. People were also just really curious about mapping Africa. Much of Africa hadn't been mapped, and Livingstone was the name of one person. He was widowed, and he was a Scottish missionary and also an abolitionist, I might say. He was not in favor of slavery. Went to try to find the source of the Nile in 1871, and Stanley followed an American journalist to try to meet up with and find Livingstone, who had become very emaciated on his trip. This is a glorified picture of the meeting of Stanley and Livingstone. That's an interesting story in and of itself. We don't really have time to talk a lot about it in class, but there are movies about it. It's a very interesting story. So colonization begins in Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium probably is known as one of the worst abusers of the people that lived in the region that he colonized. So he organizes the Congo Free State through commercial ventures to begin with, especially interested in rubber, takes control of the colony in 1908 and renamed it the Belgian Congo. It is now called the DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo. The abuses that occurred under King Leopold are some of the worst that we know of, although I'm sure they were terrible everywhere. Congo is very, very heavily wooded. Some of the resources that King Leopold was looking for in the Belgian Congo, along with others who passed through later on, were copper, tin, cobalt, zinc, rubber, etc. But if a person who was working in the Belgian Congo for the Belgians, an African, if they didn't complete their quota, they would have their hand chopped off. It was just so abusive. And there is a book called King Leopold's Ghost that highlights some of the abuses, and I may or may not show you some pictures of those in class. Britain established a strong presence in Egypt. In fact, they would build the Suez Canal in Egypt, which would be an incredible way for them to get from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. And also Rhodesia, as we can see here, northern and southern Rhodesia, is a great source for gold and diamonds. It was very, very wealthy in diamonds. As my African history teacher described it, you could kick the ground and you could find a raw diamond. Of course, now they have diamond mines. They're going deeper into the ground to get the diamonds, but it is still an area of abundant diamonds. The Berlin West Africa Conference is probably the most important thing you need to know about when it comes to colonizing Africa. At this conference, there were 14 European states represented. The United States was there as an observer only. The British, the French, Portuguese, and the Belgians were the states that were particularly interested in dividing up Africa. There were no African states present, no African people present, but they established the rules of colonization. So basically, any European state can take any, quote, unoccupied territory after informing other European powers. So, for example, if Germany wanted to take this area, they would need to just inform the others, hey, we're interested in this area. If you're not interested, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to start settling in that area. European power totally dominates Africa, and of course, people in West Africa had received some guns from the Atlantic slave trade, but overall, they just cannot beat Africa. We will talk about an exception when Ethiopia fights off Italy in 1896. They remain independent. Liberia is set up as a dependency of the U.S. This was was intended to be set up as a colony for freed slaves, and they still use the American dollar. In fact, some of them consider themselves to be part of America. This is a great picture that describes, I think, in visual form, how the Europeans basically felt about Africa. They called it the Great African Cake. And basically, they didn't consider any of the people that were there, the tribal affiliations that were there. They just thought about what was on the land, what resources could they acquire, and how would they divide up the property. Again, not considering a single individual. So this is what it will look like. We see the independent states here. The British take control of much of this eastern side of Africa. We have the French, West Africa. Still many parts of France are actually, many parts of West Africa are French speaking. We have the Germans over here. We've got, and a little bit over here, we've got the Italians here in Libya and in Somaliland. The Portuguese have Mozambique, and of course they've already settled themselves here. Oh, and the Germans are here as well. And then the Belgian Congo was an extremely wealthy region of resources. The Spanish only have this little area here, and if you think about, and here, Spanish Morocco, this is Spain right here, so very close to the Spanish border. So I'm going to stop this video here, and I will talk about African resistance on the next screencast. Thanks for your attention, and there's a map again of the partition of Africa. Thank you.